Back to Numbers chapter 11 this morning. We're going to look at the second half of the chapter this morning. And it's really a continuation almost of what we began last week. Problems, problems, problems. Who in here has never had any problems? Raise your hand. I don't think any of us can raise our hand to that. Now, raise your hand if you've had problems before. Yep, there you go. We've all had problems. We all, and when do problems come at us? When you least expect them. At different times. They come at us, when we least expect them. Sometimes we may even expect certain problems to arise. And they certainly come at us in different forms and fashions. And so as human beings, one thing we all have in common is that we all have to deal with problems. And, we all face them and ultimately have to deal with them. Now, think about this. The problem with our problems is in how we deal with or try to solve our problems. What are some ways we may try to solve our problems or deal with our problems?
Prayer.
Well, prayer, that's a proper way. That's really one of the only ways we should deal with it is with them as Christians. Prayer.
I know a lot of people can throw up their hands and say, okay, if that's it, God, just quit.
Just want to give up.
Just give up.
Yeah, I've done that before. Or, you get so frustrated at times that you just simply want to give up.
I think all of us at some point just get so frustrated with things going on.
We do.
I can't handle this. I can't deal with it.
Right. So we want to give up. We may try to ignore them, hoping they'll just go away. You ever pretended your problems just didn't exist? You ever try to solve them that way, hoping they'll just go away? Or we may push them off to the side and deal with them later. We may try to solve them on our own, even though they may be beyond the scope of our ability to solve by ourselves. We may turn to the wrong source, or we may refuse to accept the right instruction for solving our problem. When we fail to properly deal with our problems, what happens? What happens when we fail to deal properly with our problems? What often happens to us?
We start blowing things out of proportion.
That's one good answer, Sister Roberta. We began blowing things out of proportion. What did you say, Sister Carolyn?
Worse.
They might get worse. Or we might say we compound them. Would you say that Moses faced many problems during his time of leading the Israelites through the wilderness? Indeed. He had to deal with the problem of a rebellious, ungrateful, and complaining people, but he also had to deal with his own problem. And what was the problem that Moses faced last week personally that we talked about? And that we're going to hit back on here in just a moment. Too many grumbling children, but he also had a personal problem.
He didn't want to do that anyway. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, he felt burdened. He felt like he just couldn't handle all of these things on his own.
It's God, in my words, gave me this responsibility. Help me.
Right. Crying out for help. And I think that's a very important thing to know is how did Moses deal with his problems and how should we? To whom did he turn? He turned to God. And did he run from his problems? No, he didn't run from them. Did he try to ignore them or try to solve them on his own? Absolutely not. So he did the only reasonable thing. And I think this is a powerful lesson for us today as well, is that Moses turned to God. And so let's explore the problem and let's look at the solutions that God offers to these problems in Numbers chapter 11, verses 16 through 25. But we're also going to see God also solves the problem of Israel's complaining as well. And if someone would, let's read verses 16 and 17 to begin. And these two verses, I believe, set forth God's solution for Moses' leadership problem. Who wants to read those two verses for us?
So the Lord said to Moses, gather to me
Thank you, Sister Dusty. And again, as we've already alluded to, Moses was a man confronted with many problems. We talked about the constantly complaining people. And as we go throughout the study of the book of Numbers, as we continue in this study week by week, are we going to see their complaining end? Now, next week, when we get into Numbers 12, Lord willing, who are we going to see complaining this time? His own family. What's that, sis? Yeah, Aaron and Miriam. And we're going to see even his own closest of kin would complain. And again, as we've already noted, we see the second problem of leading his people. I like what the book has to say on page number 17. It's under the introductory, and I really like what our book says here. After Moses complained, going back to verse 14, for gospel preachers, faithful elders, or Christians in general to risk their health in trying to do the infinite tasks God has given his church is unwise. Some can give more and some less, but every person has limits. When Moses reached his limits, he complained, and God responded with relief. Now, the Lord allowed Moses to do things his own way until he reached a breaking point. The lawgiver had to recognize he needed help before God could relieve him. So do we all have our own breaking points? Have you ever reached your breaking point? Yeah, I have. I can't tell you how many times I've told Susan I've been frustrated at times in preaching, that I've just said, hey, this ain't worth it. Let's just quit. We all have our limits. We all reach our breaking points. We all need help. So who do we turn to? God, exactly right. And that's what Moses did. However, what's the key? If we're going to turn to God, what must we recognize? Our need for him. We can't do it on our own. We cannot do things on our own. That's exactly right, Sister Nina.
Recognize his ways, not our ways, all the way.
Yeah.
Understand why we may pray for something that doesn't happen. Hey, that's his way.
Right.
And he's in charge, he's in control, and that's what we're supposed to do.
It is.
That's what this lesson's about today.
It is. It's God in control. And we just have to accept the fact that God is in control. God cares and God knows what we go through. And God offers us the solutions to our problems. We just have to accept God's solutions, do we not?
I also see his faith in God.
Faith, yeah. And I think that's another important point. Exactly, Ricky. Brother Ricky, we got to have the faith in God. If we're going to turn to God, we got to have that faith in God. We have to have that confidence that God knows what is best. Too many times, people we're lacking faith, are we not? And isn't that the problem we see with Israel here? Is their lack of faith in God? They lacked faith because they failed to recognize that who it was that brought them out of Egypt. And they didn't believe enough that God, who brought them out of Egyptian bondage, who delivered them at the Red Sea, could provide for them. And again, we're going to see God's solution to that as well. And so here in these two verses, we see God offering Moses the help he needs. Now, do you know the population of Israel at the time that Moses spoke these words to God? Exactly right, Sister Nana. Verse number 21. Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen. Can you imagine one person trying to lead by himself, guide by himself, 600,000 people?
That's footmen.
Footmen.
That's men. That's just men.
Yeah. Right. I mean, exactly. That is a task no one person can handle alone. How would you feel if you had to do that by yourself? Throw your hands up and say, whew. But But Moses couldn't do it alone. So God tells him, get 70 men of the elders of Israel and officers over them. And the number 70 suggests a full complement of persons come to the tabernacle. And so just as Moses had authority delegated to him by God, God would delegate authority to these 70 by him. And certainly God would take of the spirit of Moses and place it upon these men. And as a result, these men became joint sharers in leadership with Moses. They would bear the burden of the people along with Moses. No longer would Moses bear it alone. Now, what's a good application of this? How does this relate today? Moses received help in bearing the burden of leadership.
Well, it may be in church, in a sense. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't just, you're not converted to Christianity and just sit down and do nothing.
Right. Galatians 6, you're exactly right, Brother Carl. Now, Galatians 6:5 teaches us what? Every man must bear his own what? Burdens. But yet you go back to verse number 2, we find that we can help one another do what? Bear each other's burdens. Bear ye one another's burdens, so fulfill the law of Christ. So we can help one another bear we bear our own burdens, but we help others bear their burdens, and they help us bear our burdens, do they not? It's a cooperative effort. Because as Christians, we work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Salvation is a personal matter, is it not? But is it not true that we can help one another go to heaven? That is very true. We provoke one another. We encourage one another. We exhort one another. And that's why we bear one another's burdens. And just as these 70 would help Moses bear his burden, we need to help one another bear our burdens. And so I think in these two verses, that's one of the great principles we find for today, is that God provides a solution for our burdens. He provided Moses with the 70. He provides us today with brethren. As Christians, we be brethren. And we help one another bear our burdens.
Temptation's not near as strong when you're with Christian people as it is when you're with non-Christian.
Exactly, Sister Dusty. That's exactly right. And that's why we need one another. That's why we lean upon one another and rely upon one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. And you're going to find afterwards, this would really renew Moses. His faith would be renewed. Now again, though we say that, we're going to see Moses ask a question here in just a moment in verses 18 through 23 that really he should have already knew the answer to. That really he probably had no business of asking. But now, with that thought in mind, let's look at verses 18 through 23. And let's look at God's solution. And again, remember, this is God's solution for Moses' question regarding the people's desire. Someone would read verses 18 through 23 for us here.
And I say thou unto the people, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and ye shall eat. Flesh for ye have wept, and the tears of the Lord, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you flesh, and ye shall eat. You shall not eat one another. You shall not eat one day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, never can live in 4 days. But even the whole month until you come out of your nostrils, and be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and you have wept before him, saying, we came out forth from Egypt. And Moses said unto the people, whom I am, to the people whom I am, 600,000 footmen, has said, I will give flesh, that they may eat. How much you really say, read? Huh?
Through 23. Go ahead and read down through 23.
Okay. And thou shall the flock and the herds be slain for thee, to suffice thee. Or shall all fish of the sea be gathered together for thee, to suffice thee? And the Lord said unto Moses, the Lord's hand waxed short, thou shalt see now whether my word shall come to pass to thee or not.
All right, thank you, Brother Carl. Very interesting section here. What is the first thing God tells people to do in verse 18?
Sanctify yourselves, consecrate yourselves.
You sanctify yourselves against tomorrow. Why did God tell them to do this? Why did God tell them to sanctify themselves? What was going to happen on the morrow? What's that, Sister?
He was going to come among them, wasn't he? So he had to be sanctified and consecrated.
He was going to come among them, and also a second thing was going to happen. And who was it going to come from?
The Spirit that you put on Moses.
No, verse 18. Exactly. And the Lord will give you meat, and ye shall eat. Now, when we look at this section, verses 18 through 20, especially the latter portion of verse 18, we see their unbelief, do we not? Because they ask, who shall give us flesh to eat? Now, where was their minds at this time?
Back in Egypt.
Back in Egypt. We're going to talk more about this in the lesson tonight, and really studying for class tonight's really what spawned the thought for tonight's lesson. Life in Egypt. So they had left Egypt, but in essence, they really hadn't come out of Egypt, had they?
I like the plain Egypt worse than it was in Egypt.
Isn't that amazing, Brother Carl? How bad was it for them in Egypt?
Slaves, they were mistreated.
It was bad. And yet here you have this people complaining that they're wanting to do what? That they had it better where? In Egypt. Can you imagine that?
The faith didn't last long, did
It did not last long. I like what the book says on page 18. As in the past they forgot the lashes of the Egyptians, they were selective in their memory of the good old days.
I was just thinking about that. I look back from the time I grew up, the good old days, and there were good things happening. But I grew up in poverty. We ate meat once a week. We worked hard. Even the children had to work hard to have food to eat. I grew up on a farm.
Yeah.
But to me, looking back, I have wonderful memories of it. But there was a lot of bad things happened during that time too. But I have sort of pushed those out to the side. I don't think about that. I remember the good times.
Uh-huh.
And whenever they were talking about what they said, that they look back at Egypt and how much better they had it there. We forget sometimes just how bad we had it. Because good things take over those memories. And, we also, a lot of times we are very ungrateful and take for granted that we deserve more than what we have.
That is exactly right. They had forgotten how bad they really had it, and they were ungrateful, were they not? Israel is probably the greatest example in the Bible of ingratitude. When we look at what God did for them, how did they react every time? When they were delivered from bondage, when they came to the Red Sea, what was their first response?
Bring us out here to die.
Complain. Even after God brought them over the Red Sea, when God fed them with manna, how did they react to the manna?
Sick and tired of it.
Sick and tired of it. So they were ingrates, were they not? And this shows you right here. They had forgotten just really how bad they had it in Egypt. They forgot the lashes. They forgot the hard labor. All they could think about was what?
And
the good stuff they had to eat.
And the grumbling that don't have me right now, they don't understand.
Yeah. You know, like I said, this lesson really goes to follow up the last week's here in our study, and we're seeing just how far a grumbling spirit takes a people. It stems from ingratitude and unbelief. But God tells them what? What's He going to say? What did God say to them?
I'm gonna get you your meat.
If you want flesh, you're going to get it. And it is as if He is saying, if the desire for meat is your preoccupation, well, it's meat you're going to have. Now, verses 19 and 20 here, was this going to really be a blessing to them or a curse? It's going to be a curse. So is God going to use this meat as a form of punishment upon them? Would you say that?
I think so, but God knows best.
He's going to teach them. And again, He's going to promise. Again, notice, as Brother Carl read for us, the promise of verses 19 and 20. God's going to do this. You're not going to have it 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. You're going to have it a whole month. Now notice how it's described here in verse 20. Until it does what? Come at. That's a vivid description.
I think it means you're gonna vomit it. You're gonna be-
More likely, yes, because you're going to be sick of it. It's going to be loathsome to them. And the reason being for such is that they despised the one who was among them, that was God, who had brought them out of Egypt, who had provided for their needs, and the one who saw their longing for Egypt and their desire to return to Egypt. Now, it's not part of our lesson, but you go down to verse 33, and look what happened there. While the flesh was yet between their teeth, and it was chewed, what came upon them? In verse 33 of Numbers 11. Great plague came upon them. And God's righteous indignation. And Israel would discover once again that God was not to be reduced to a giver who was under obligation to meet the demands of Israel. And isn't that how people at times today treat God? They recognize Him as a good God and as the giver of all good and perfect gifts. So do people treat God as if He just, as someone to be at their beck and call to meet their every need? Gimme, 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 gimme. As Santa Claus? I think that's a good analogy, Sister Roberta.
I think we all take God for granted.
We do. That's true. We take the blessings for granted. And again, I think we've alluded to this. Do we at times think we get the mindset that we deserve these blessings?
You need to be careful what you pray for. Because you shouldn't ask for some specific thing.
Right.
Because you don't know what down the road means. You should ask for God to give you what is best. For Him to deal with what's best for you.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, let me win the lottery and win
Yeah.
$1 million, and then you may go stone crazy if He gives it to you or something bad happened to you.
Right.
A lot of people will pray when some of their families are real sick, really, really sick, and you pray for God not to take them, and a lot of times that's not the thing to do because the suffering they go through, if God answers your prayer.
We should I think the key,
may not be worth it.
I think that's some excellent points, Sister Dusty. We need to pray, at all times in our praying, we need to say, not my will, but Thy will be done.
My friend who is very, very sick said to me about 2 weeks before he got so sick, Nina, there's a lot of things worse than this. And there is. And then I think back, he told me,
Right.
he's so sick. But it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Sick also, Alzheimer's. To me, that's worse than death.
Right.
You should not live in who you are.
Mhm.
Know who you are. I have a sister 2 years younger than me that's developed it. It just makes me really sad because she's not, it's like she's empty.
Mm-hmm.
You look
It's hard to see people living like that. I mean,
See love and suffering,
I
Mhm.
They don't follow logic, they don't remember.
Right. So-
And I thought of so much of what he said, you know, it helped me. There's a lot of things.
We just have to rely upon God. And again, as Sister Dusty pointed out, we need to be careful what we pray for. And I think the key thing is, if it be thy will. Pray in accordance to the will of God and rely upon God, trust in God. And we got to recognize that God knows what is best. I think that, that's the problem we often have, is that we try to think we know what's best and God doesn't, do we not? How do we get out of that mindset? How do we get to the point in our lives where we come to accept the fact that God knows what is best and that God is in control?
That's the way to study.
Study. Study.
When God told Moses, get out of Egypt, he knew he couldn't do that alone.
Right.
He had a plan.
God had a plan. Moses at first didn't want to accept that plan because he tried to make excuses. But you see what happened when God removed the excuses? He gave Moses Aaron as his spokesperson. So God provides help. And he provides us with help too, as we already observed.
We make excuses sometimes, Robert. I've got myself making excuses why I should do this or why I should do that. They don't make it right.
It's easy to get into the mindset of making excuses. Is it not? We've all been there and done that.
Another word for it is rationalization.
You can rationalize it.
You can talk yourself into it.
And that's why so many people are going to die in a lost condition, is it not? They make excuses for why they don't obey the gospel. Or they rationalize it. Well, I've got time. I can do it then. Is that true? Do we have time?
This is what is that, is God.
And it's all, you can apply this to erring Christians as well. They may think, well, I've got time, When God never said that. God said life is but a vapor. He also said that today is the day of salvation, did he not?
You do things your way when you have that kind of thought, I got time, or
Yeah. That's when you're not relying upon God. And you're walking by sight rather than by faith. And so we see God has the solution to all the problems. However, again, as we pointed out, Moses asked a question. Verse 21, he couldn't understand how God will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. So Moses saw the problem, but what's his failure here? Exactly, Sister Dusty. His failure is to trust God to handle it. He failed to recognize the power of God to accomplish this. Otherwise, he would have asked that.
That's the human side of us here.
Moses here, I guess we could say Moses here was limiting God, limiting what God could do. Could he not? Was he not?
But it's odd after all the miracles he had already seen, so I think he was just tired and worn
I
out.
think so, Sister Roberta, and I think that's very ironic with all that Moses had seen, with all the plagues that had been brought down upon Egypt, with the events at the Red Sea, with the manna, and Moses here now is just asking this. I think that's probably what was going on, Sister Roberta. He was so burdened, he was just beaten down and worn out. So God asked Moses a question here, verse 23, and it has a built-in answer, does it not? Is the Lord's hand waxed short? Answer's built in, is it not? Moses should have known the answer right away. In essence, God is challenging Moses to wait and see if his divine power was too weak to accomplish such. And again, the irony, as Sister Roberta pointed out, just as Moses had told the skeptical Israelites at the Red Sea, remember, he told them, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. In essence here, Moses needed to stand still and see the power of God to provide what was going to be provided. So when Moses told Israel to stand still and see God's power, it is Moses himself here needing to stand still.
And too, was Moses still thinking that he was going to have to do the work? Am I going to have to slaughter all these animals? Am I going to have to go?
I think that's a possibility.
Is it still going to be my burden to provide this?
I think that's a good, plausible explanation, Sister Roberta. He's still in that mindset of, I got to do this. He's still, and God, he doesn't rebuke Moses, but yet he's correcting that mindset with these words to show him that it's not you who's going to do this. You don't have that power, Moses. It is I and I alone who has the power. Now look at verses 24 and 25. God's solutions are applied by Moses in Israel. If someone would, read these two verses for us.
And Moses went out and told the people of the words of the Lord, and gathered the 70 men of the elders of the people, and set them around about the tabernacle. And the Lord came down in a cloud, and spake unto them, and took the spirit that was upon him, and gave it unto the 70 elders. And it came to pass that when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied and did not cease.
All right. Thank you. Verse 24. Moses told the people the words of the Lord. That is, he told them all God had said. And he was being faithful in his duties here, was he not? God had spoken to him, and the people needed to hear it. And again, that's why we preach today. God has spoken. And people need to hear the word of God. Mark 16:15. We also see here the selection of the 70 men. And who they were set round about the tabernacle. And again, we don't know who all these 70 men were, but we do know that 70 men were selected. Now, what happened after Moses selected the 70? Here in verse 25, what happens?
The Lord gave them the spirit of leadership.
Gave them the spirit of leadership. And when it rested upon them, they began to speak messages that God gave to them. Now, what did this act confirm them as? What did this act show? God's approval. Exactly right, Sister Dusty. Showed God's approval. It confirmed them as divinely appointed aides to Moses. And again, when did their work begin as aides to Moses? Right then, promptly, immediately. And again, this in turn would do what for Moses? Lighten the burden, ease it. It lightened his load. And it certainly made it easier for him to handle the responsibilities God had given to him. And, we all need help from time to time. And yeah, that is the very power of God. Is that God offers help. But what do we have to do? Have faith and accept God's help. Obey Him.
It's like when he says, go in all the world, preach about. Yeah, everybody can't go.
No.
But we have a responsibility to support or send, so in that sense, we're going in all.
We are. Exactly right, Brother Carl.
Brother James Andrews preached the best sermon on that one night, that he was substituting for the hell. It was like, it got me thinking of another, hey, I'm not just sitting on my laurels when I sacrificed to kill or sinned.
Right.
And I said, just never, he brought out some things and I just never did it.
That's a good. And again, the Great Commission is greater than one man could actually ever do by himself, is it not?
He knows that it's his plan, though.
That was the plan all the time. God expects every one of His children. That's a command. That's for all Christians, all over the world. And we don't have to go. And again, I've said this before, and I'll say it again here since you brought it up, Brother Carl. We don't have to go across the world to go into all the world, do we? I go right out my back door, and I'm in the world. You go to work, you're in the world. So as Christians, every day when we live Christ-like and when we teach others, hey, we're going into the world, whether it's a block down the road, a mile down the road, 100 miles down the road, or 1,000 miles away, or 10,000 miles away. You step out here, you're in the world.
That's my best argument to get Lou and Michael to come home. I mean, I know they're needed there. It's obvious, but,
I'm thankful for missionaries overseas. Obviously, we all are, but I would also suggest as well, we need as much help here at home in the United States as possible as well, spreading the gospel. Do we not?
Michael, we're heathen too, stay with us and help us. It didn't work.
But yes,
There's different preachers or people who are different in that they are able to go and do the mission work
Right.
other places.
mm-hmm.
There's difficulty in teaching the gospel no matter where you live.
Exactly.
There's a lot of places other than the United States respond much better. And that people can really do good work over there. But when I think about how people, the lack of response
Mm-hmm.
we're getting now and the things we're losing now here, it's really gets to me. And I keep wondering if God's going to listen to
And I would suggest,
give up on us.
and I would suggest a lack of response today. Again, you go back to the 40s, 50s, 60s. The Lord's Church was the fastest growing religious institution in the 50s. It grew by 500%. What made it? Why was growth then so explosive? For those of you who lived back then,
It came through the war, I think. I didn't live back then, but we came through wars.
And the depression, people, they had a desire to do things.
One thing I noticed back in the day was, I didn't hear all these arguments between churches. It was like, I didn't hear that. So fighting and drumming all the time. And I'm not saying that these places were right, domination. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about you didn't hear the drumming.
You heard the gospel, you heard the pure gospel, and
Yep.
I sort of differ with you, because they weren't afraid to declare it. Let the chips fall.
right?
And God did give the increase.
So many people, and the problem today is so many people are offended by God and His Word.
And
You know,
you tell them about how to obey the gospel, and they believed. They told them the truth,
mhm.
and it just.
People back then really wanted to know, were more concerned with what does the Bible say? Today it seems like more people are, well, what does my preacher have to say? They have a problem, instead of turning to the right source, they turn to man. They don't turn to the Bible, they turn to man, unfortunately.
The church was more disciplined
More disciplined?
back then than it is now. You just, certain things you didn't accept, that was just it. You didn't evade the issue, you didn't stir it and sugarcoat it.
And then that spreads across.
Could we not say that the problem?
Well, look at ISIS growing today. They are so disciplined and they're so dedicated and they're so strict, and people are just flogging to them. They're growing by leaps and bounds because of that strict discipline, that iron hand.
And the problem is we've allowed the world to enter the church. Instead of seeing Christ in the church, the world seeing the world. Why would we want to change when they're just behaving like we are?
People happy with it, so.
Right.
It's really said, somebody said, oh, but I like that,
So we have problems, but God has the answer. So as we close, two observations. On one hand, man has the problems. God alone is the answer to man's every problem, is He not? The solution is to be found through His Word. And we just have to accept the solution. We just have to use and apply this book. Because God gave Moses the answers to his problems, and Moses applied the solutions. We just have to apply God's solutions to our lives and to our society. On the other hand, when men have a problem with God, as Israel did in their murmuring, we rest assured that God will deal with the problem. If we don't accept God's solution, He'll solve it on His own in righteousness. And His judgments are righteous.